This video is part 1 on indirect painting. Today I'll be making a monochromatic underpainting using just burnt umber and white that will be the basis for adding transparent color. As opposed to direct painting, where the majority of your colors are going to be opaque and mixed on your palette, or even on the painting itself, indirect painting makes use of the transparent qualities of certain pigments to allow you to separate rendering and color into different stages. This makes rendering complex forms somewhat easier because you can focus on getting the correct shapes and values using a single color and white, rather than trying to get the final color, value, and shape all at the same time. You also have more flexibility with trying out colors in the glazing stage because you can add and remove transparent glazes after you see how they look. As usual, I'm starting on an imprimatura of raw umber acrylic. When it's fully dry, I started sketching the figure with some burnt umber oil, slightly diluted with terpenoid to make it easier to create flowing lines. The actual underpainting is going to emerge very organically out of this sketch, because I'm also using the burnt umber as my only shadow color for the underpainting. The mindset is quite similar to the jigsaw puzzle direct painting approach I talked about in the last video, except that now I'm only using 2 colors, the burnt umber and titanium white. I'm trying to keep shadow values isolated from the highlights to avoid having to make drastic changes to an already wet surface. You have to remember you only have 3 hours this week to make your entire underpainting. So the same rules apply of keeping your different values separate. Because I'm working off of medium tone ground, I'm able to block in highlights and shadows pretty much simultaneously, making sure to switch brushes or wipe off excess paint when I switch from one value to the other. I'm also trying to mix the particular value of burnt umber and white as carefully as I can on the palette before applying it. But that being said, there's definitely a lot of blending that happens on the painting surface as this jigsaw puzzle gets more and more filled in. A thing you want to keep in mind is that glazes can only darken the surface of your underpainting. Even when you add bright, transparent, warm colors like bright orange, pink, red, yellow to make the highlights, the glazes are still going to slightly darken the underpainting. So you want to err on the side of making the underpainting slightly too bright, almost like an overexposed photograph. Whereas in direct painting, you want to reserve your white for the brightest highlights and use it very sparingly. In this underpainting, you're really going to go all out with using white. There is another method of indirect painting that starts with a bright white gesso ground and uses a very washy adding and subtracting method of underpainting using just one dark color. You leave the gesso visible for your highlight, or you can wipe away the burnt umber or whatever shadow color you're using with a rag to bring the highlights back. Depending on how well you prepare your canvas or panel, an underpainting made this way can certainly work for glazing, but you need to use something with a very rich texture, like oil ground, or many layers of acrylic gesso put on with something smooth like a squeegee or a palette knife. The issue with typical thin coats of acrylic gesso applied with a brush is that they're very absorbent when you first start painting. So glazing on an acrylic gesso underpainting usually leaves a very dry and unconvincing surface that doesn't have the tactile qualities of human skin that you really want from an oil painting. So for that reason, I always prefer glazing over actual oil paint, whether it's an oil ground or an underpainting with the highlights built up with white oil and small amounts of your shadow color. On a texture note, I try to give the underpainting a smoother surface with fewer visible brush marks than a typical direct painting. The reason for this is that glazes will settle into the grooves of the brushstrokes and make any visible texture really stand out. The glazes will also have a gestural quality of their own, and having multiple layers of transparent brushstrokes showing through can quickly get too busy. So the underpainting shouldn't be overly textured unless you want a very expressionistic final painting with lots of visible marks. Now, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't be considering the direction and the shape of your brushstrokes. Controlling the direction of your brushstrokes is still going to be one of your most effective ways of conveying volume in your underpainting, and you want all that dimensional information to remain visible in the final painting. It just means that you may want to use softer brushes and try to create a fairly seamless surface, maybe with some blending whenever you see a smooth transition from one value to another. and you can fine-tune this and get even more accurate rendering when you're adding glazes. That pretty much covers the underpainting phase. I'll record part 2 of this video next week when this is fully dry and ready to add color.